Hey everybody, so the most ridiculous thing just happened. I recorded basically this month's entire video and then my phone stopped for a reason that I thought was because I was over in a really sunny spot and I thought it overheated. But it turns out my phone storage was full, which has never happened to me because I store things in iCloud. And anyway, I don't know what's going on with that, but I didn't really like that video anyway because I was sitting in the sun and I was squinting and it was hot. So I'm going to start the video over. And as you can see, thankfully, because the weather is pretty nice in Kyoto today, I am not in my dumpy, gloomy room this time. I am outside by the Shirakawa Canal, which is this little river that flows through Higashiyama. It starts up at like Heian Shrine and it goes all the way down to Gion. And I'm sort of right here in the middle, not far from where I live. So I hope this is a really beautiful setting for a video that, I don't know, it's not a really beautiful topic because I think that once again, I feel like this is sort of the way every video has started the past few months, but not a lot has changed. So I guess I wanted to start this video talking about three recent pieces of news I've seen and how they all embody the same basic problem that I think is keeping Japan stuck in place when it comes to opening the border and I guess responding to the pandemic in general. The first one was a letter from Kobe University that Stranded Out Japan posted on their Twitter that was talking about the fact that they've actually decided to preemptively cancel the fall semester for foreign students. Which is really outrageous and unbelievable, but also totally believable with how 2021 has gone with regard to the pandemic in Japan. The second one was a series of articles that talked about the fact that Japan's travel surplus, which is basically the part of Japan's budget that's related to imports and exports of travel, is the lowest it's been since the 2011 tsunami and earthquake. And then the third one was talking about JTB, which is a large Japanese travel agency, was talking about their record loss that they've experienced in the past year. And these three pieces of news have two things in common. The first thing they have in common is this tendency, especially in Japan, but not exclusively here, to blame the pandemic for a certain problem when really at this point, 15 months in, it's not as much about the disease itself as it is about the conscious policy decisions that have been made ostensibly in response to the pandemic. But it's also about the fact that I think people in Japan are ignoring the fundamental truth of this matter, which is that immunity is the only way epidemics end, preferably through vaccination, also potentially through natural immunity or a combination thereof, as we're seeing in the US and the UK as they get back to normal. But I think that until Japan addresses this, which is to say with a dramatic acceleration of its vaccine rollout, we're not really going to see a lot of change. And of course, this is not only a Japanese problem, right? You know, most of Asia Pacific is totally closed to the world. But I do see some big things changing right now. And the bad news is that in the short term, neither in terms of the countries where they're changing nor in terms of Japan, I don't really think that's going to change anything. But I do think that, well, let's look at a couple examples. So we have new outbreaks in Singapore, in Taiwan, and now in Victoria, Australia, which were three parts of the world that most pundits, certainly pundits who traffic in innuendo rather than facts and reality, had basically concluded had beat the pandemic, hiding behind their borders and or masks. And now the fact that the virus has resurged in all three of these places, I think, again, at least for people who traffic in facts and who think with their heads, this has caused a sort of reevaluation of whether or not these strategies, which again, sane people realized these were doomed and just kicking the can down the road from day one, but whether these strategies are actually sustainable and a good idea. You know, I saw several posts actually in the past week, I say posts, articles, in the South China Morning Post, basically talking about the fact that even Hong Kong, which has had some of the strictest borders in the world, is going to have to eventually concede that infection is going to have to be allowed in. And the columnist, in one in particular, he had a great idea. He said, you know, it could really get some pep in people's step because Hong Kong has wonderful vaccine supplies. They have enough vaccines for every adult, I think, but only something like 20% of people, mostly foreigners, have signed up for them. He said, if you set a date, let's say September 1st, for the reopening of the borders quarantine-free, which is to say informing people that, yes, infection is going to start circulating here again, and there's nothing you can do about it, I think that might inspire at least the vulnerable members of society to get the COVID jab and protect themselves from severe illness and death. In Australia, again, as insane as they've been throughout this time, Gladys Berejiklian, the Premier of New South Wales, where Sydney is, and the only sane politician in that country who should absolutely be the next Prime Minister, she's very clearly stated that once, I guess, 5 out of 6 adults in New South Wales have had their first vaccination, she is open to reopening the international border to Sydney. Taiwan's a little bit different because due to China's interference, they're having a lot of trouble getting vaccines. And I think that in spite of the fact that they tend to be a really science and fact-based country, they just are really obsessed with the zero COVID fantasy. They're really invested in this this fairy tale that masks work. They're really keen to stay hidden behind their borders until the pandemic is under control worldwide, which I think, again, as we've seen with the recent surge in India, that's not going to happen for years. And so it's mixed news throughout Asia. And I think, again, where Japan is so weird in all this is Japan has never been zero COVID, right? There have always been uncontrolled local outbreaks here and local spread that right now, with how low infection levels are in the UK and the US and most of Europe, on a per capita basis, are actually more severe than what you find overseas. And so it never made sense for Japan to have a zero tolerance border policy, but it especially doesn't make sense now, particularly given the fact that life here is totally normal, and the people who are bringing additional infection into the country, I mean, it's like adding additional water to the ocean. It doesn't fucking matter. But are Japanese people who are flouting quarantine. Although on that note, it's funny. So I was watching it's not funny, it's horrible because this fucking sucks, but I was watching the press conference with the chief cabinet secretary yesterday. And he was talking about the fact that, border controls have been further strengthened, which, again, I mean, they were already blocking all foreigners from entering, basically. I don't know how you strengthen that. It's how do you make a rock harder? But some reporter from the Asahi Shimbun, which is not a far-right rag by any means, was asking, well, can you strengthen them further? And he, to his credit, he has a sense of humor still. And he said, well, I guess we could close them totally and not permit Japanese to enter at all. But we're not going to consider that right now. Now, I wish he was a little bit funnier and a little bit more humane in realizing that there are a lot of foreigners who have a valid need to get into Japan irrespective of the infection situation. But, Rome wasn't built in a day. Going forward, I think the picture continues to be somewhat bleak because on one hand, I was watching Suga himself at a press conference on May 28th, and he was talking about that last Thursday, so this is a Friday press conference, last Thursday, Japan reached a milestone. They had 400,000 vaccinations in one day, which was up from 200,000 just a few days earlier. And if that trend continues, Japan could reach Suga's goal of 1 million vaccines a day by June 15th, which could potentially see every Japanese person, or 60% of Japanese people rather, have their first dose by October 1st. Which I just created that number in my head. I don't know if that's any sort of milestone for them, but that would be a significant development on the immunity front, because although Japan will not publicly acknowledge that this is what's needed to end the pandemic and get back to normal once and for all, you have to think that there are people behind closed doors, maybe even Suga himself, that realize this is the only end game. But I think that two things are standing in the way of any commitment to any date, be that October 1st, December 1st, January 1st, what have you. Obviously, the Olympics, we don't know if those are going to happen. The IOC is insisting that they are. The Japanese government's being really stubborn. 80% of Japanese people don't fucking want them to happen. I don't think they should happen. And there's a great chance that if they do, there's going to be some sort of a super spreader event, and which will further delay everything. So there's the Olympics. Even if there is no super spreader event, even if they go completely according to plan, we are looking at probably best case scenario, the sort of afterglow from that event, if you include the Paralympics as well, not lifting until around September 1st. Then you have the fact that Suga is going to call general elections sometime in the autumn, I think no earlier than September. So really, even if everything goes according to plan with the Olympics, the election is early, and the vaccination rollout proceeds swimmingly, it's going to be October 1st before they can even really discuss opening the borders. Because, of course, as is the case in many countries around the world, closed borders and a general anti-foreigner sentiment are very, very popular with Japanese voters. So I think that's the unfortunate reality around what's going to happen moving forward. Now, in terms of what we can do, on one hand, unfortunately, the G7 travel meeting that occurred last month, in the lead up to the actual G7, which is a couple weeks from now, it appears to have achieved nothing. Suga had a call with the UK this morning. You can read the transcript on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, but there wasn't a single word mentioned about travel, any sort of travel, be it tourism, people-to-people exchanges for business and education, nothing. There wasn't a single word. Now, it is possible that the G7 could hammer out a framework at the actual meeting this month for travel between nations. I mean, Canada, even, which has had almost as strict border controls as Japan, has talked about potentially allowing American tourists to come with vaccine passports, just as Europe and the UK and the US are already discussing, and in some cases it's already in effect. But my fear is that they're going to let Japan off the hook, because as I talked about in the last video, what seems to be happening is people around the world just assume that Japan knows what they're talking about. There's this presumption of competence that I just, especially after living here for the past 6 months, don't think is deserved. And I think that they let Japan skate by, on one hand, as if they're totally superior, but on the other hand, as if there's some third world backwater that is not deserving of scrutiny. So, I think that something could happen then, but it probably won't if past this predicate. But then in terms of the action steps we can take on that, I think there's a few things. I think number one, find out who your country's representatives are for that G7 meeting and hammer them with emails and tweets. Number two, contact representatives and the general Twitter account for your embassy or consulate in Japan, as well as for the Japanese embassy in your country. Number three, get in contact with international bodies. I think IATA would be the best example of this. They're an organization that they've been really good on Love is Not Tourism, for example, as a general rule, but they have totally gone soft on Japan. I don't think they've said a single word about Japan other than to praise ANA for trialing the IATA travel pass, which makes no sense because even ANA's own press release said nothing about opening borders. It essentially just referenced the fact that now salarymen who gallivant around the world freely are going to be able to more easily ascertain the minimal travel restrictions they face. So I think that's probably the best action step we can take. I think obviously follow Stranded at Japan, follow Davide Ross, and follow me on Twitter if you haven't already done so, because I retweet everything else that I see. But unfortunately, I think that it's going to be a cruel summer, to reference the 80s hit, for people who hope to enter Japan. And as I said in March and April and May, I wish I had better news for you. It makes me really sad that I don't. But we have to keep the faith. We have to realize that in the long term, this too shall pass. Pandemics end. Moral panics end. I think we're more in a moral panic than a disease pandemic at this point. And things will eventually go back to normal. I hope that eventually comes before January 1st, 2022. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like, share, or leave a comment. And I guess I will talk to you guys next month. All right, bye.